Idealism prevails. Make the world a better place.
Good evening, everybody. Good evening, especially our guest. Unfortunately, Irina Bolgova could not come personally to Vienna at the end, but we have her. You see her, you will listen to her, and hopefully Skype is functioning as well as the last time, where it was functioning excellent. So again, welcome especially Minister Jankovic and Ambassador Sramik, who are still in diplomatic businesses. I think it is very important now to discuss the situation in Russia, and of course with all the changes. Certainly Russia is, and Mr. Putin as president has been very successful in the past years. But as it is with all successes, new challenges arise. Challenges at home for himself. What should he do after 2024, I think? How is his life planning, but not only for him, but especially also for Russia, because there are still a lot of challenges, economic challenges, political challenges at home he has to deal with. But also internationally, has been successful in many ways, but on the other hand, the Ukraine issue is still open also for him, not only for the European Union, Ukraine itself. And if you look to the Middle East, what will happen when Mr. Assad is maybe controlling the whole country? Is it a good ally for the Russian president? What about Iran and the competition between Iran and Russia? What about the new disputes with Turkey about Idlib and other issues? So I think it is very good to hear from experts from Russia itself how things will probably develop in the coming years, because it's very important also for the European side. Who is our partner, opponent, and will it be more a partner or more opponent in the future, and how to deal with the other big European power? And I think, for me at least, it's a European power. And the European Union, of course, has to find strategy for the future. Mr. Macron, as president, is trying to find new ways of dialogue. At the same time, of course, making it clear that we have to have a strong voice, not soft, but nevertheless, on the other hand, to have the dialogue. Our institute is dedicated always to the question and to the issue of dialogue, because even if we have differences, and we have differences between Russia and the European Union side, it is important to have that kind of dialogue. And again, this is the purpose of tonight. And thank you very much for Alexander Dubowy, who was initiating this debate and will be part of the debate, because, as I said, it's much better to have a dialogue than confrontation, because confrontation could be too dangerous for all the sides. Again, thank you very much for coming, and I hand over to Stephanie Fenkert, who will manage and moderate in her wonderful style this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannes. So also from my side, a very warm welcome. I mean, I think it's not a coincidence that so many of you came here today. I think it's a very interesting time to talk about Russia and what is going on within Russia, and also the implications it will have domestically, but also when it comes to the European Union and also more to the east. Before I go on, I would just also shortly would like to mention Alexander Dubowy, and especially also the Research Center for Eurasian Studies, who is our cooperation partner today and who was also initially picking up this topic. So thank you very much, Alexander.
Thank you.
And I would also like to welcome our two guests from Russia. First, it's Greg Yudin. You're very much welcome. And also, unfortunately, only via Skype, but I think we can see her quite well, and she can hear us well. Irina Bolgova, also from Moscow right now. I think it came as a big surprise that in his annual State of the Nation speech, President Putin shook actually up the country and its political class by surprisingly calling for constitutional changes. I think it was not really seen by many that this step will come right now. And also following this step, that the whole cabinet of Medvedev resigned was also probably not foreseen in this extraordinarily short manner. Mikhail Mishustin, I would say not a very well-known Federal Tax Service, head of the Federal Tax Service, a technocrat, became new prime minister. And we also see now this limited, not this limited, but we will see some constitutional reforms maybe, and we don't really know what is going on with it. What will this implicate for Putin, its foreign policy, its power shift domestically? And I hope that in the next 1.5 hours we are going to tackle these issues with our guests, and I look forward to a very interesting discussion. I would like to start maybe first with you, Greg. Greg Yudin is a sociologist at the Higher School of Economics, and he will share with us more, I would say, a little bit the domestical and what is going on within Russia, what civil society, what the people in Russia are thinking. And my question to you would be, what do you think? Why did Putin decide to present his constitutional reform now? I mean, it's 4 years before the official end of his terms. And do you think that maybe also we had quite big protests already last year, I mean, the year before in 2018, do you think that this also has an implication that he has the feeling he's losing support, or how legitimate is Putin's Russia nowadays for the Russian public? What would you, if you could elaborate some 5 to 7 minutes about what is going on domestically?
First of all, I would like to thank you for the kind invitation, and thank you for these introduction words. I must confess that I just flew from Moscow yesterday, and in Moscow for almost a month already. There is this feeling of ambiguity and uncertainty about what has actually happened there. So I can represent only in that sense, perhaps, the mood of the elites there in Russia, where there is hardly any clear understanding of where is it all heading. And that means that in order to stay close to the facts and not to get involved in broad speculations, we perhaps should focus on the things that can be clearly established in what has been happening so far and what we already know for sure. And I would probably point to 2 things that we know for sure, and one of them is perhaps not that obvious from the first side. So one thing we know for sure, it doesn't matter what is the meaning of those reforms suggested and those political events to come, but one thing we know for sure is that we will have a plebiscite. Plebiscite scheduled, so news came from Moscow today that they're considering to schedule it for April 22nd, which is quite unusual for Russia. It would be the first time that this plebiscite would be held on a weekday, not on a weekend. And that is important just because I think the plebiscite itself is a crucial event for that type of political system. Well, my viewpoint is that Russia represents a very good case of plebiscitary regime. Which means that this is a regime operated through a series of plebiscites. Sometimes they're called elections, but no one really perceives them as elections. Nobody really understands them as elections. They're not meant to be a competition between different political parties or between politicians. They function as plebiscites. That was particularly clear perhaps in 2018 when no matter who ran for the presidency formally, but obviously a plebiscite, an occasion for the incumbent, for the president to get additional trust from the people. And this is basically how a plebiscitarian system operates. It has a direct connection between the people and the president. And the rest, both the bureaucracy, the parliament, or the branches of power, they actually work in an administrative manner. So there is this direct connection between the president and the people. And for that reason, the president is always above the whole system. So he's basically meant to be the only politician in the country. That also means that politics is the political life is deeply depoliticized. The dominant perception among Russian people is that politics is a dirty thing. And one shouldn't be engaged in politics. I guess, well, you're perhaps familiar with that because that's a general symptom of liberal democracies all over the world, but perhaps in Russia it can be seen very, very clearly. So the level of political engagement, of political participation in Russia is very, very low. And if you're not forced to participate, there's probably no reason for most of the population to be engaged in politics. So this is how the system works. But when the system relies on those regular plebiscites, it actually means that they have to be frequent enough to provide legitimacy to the political system. And I think that now we're at the point when there are obvious issues with political legitimacy for the leader, and hence, in this type of regime, for the system, for the whole system. Now, can talk perhaps of what are the reasons for that, but generally. It could be seen even in back in 2018 during the presidential election, when it was the first time in Russian history and the incumbent, the president, got at least officially got 50% of the total vote of the total electorate, which means vote for the president multiplied by the turnout. This is essential for the plebiscitarian regimes because they rely on this feeling of the popular support for the leader. Now, if you're not able to get even 50% of the support, which was always the case with previous elections, the legitimacy of the plebiscitarian leader becomes dubious. For that reason, the task was for the first time to get 50% of the vote. Well, actually, they got probably 45 or 46. The rest was added in a skillful manner. But at least officially, they got 50% of the vote for the president. And that meant an unprecedented politicization of the population. So people who normally wouldn't go to the polling stations were, let's admit it, forced to get there. And many portions of the populations that believe that they are immune from political life suddenly got involved in political life, and they formed their expectations. They voted for Vladimir Putin. There were no other plausible candidates on the list, but that meant that they did it so in a conscious manner, formed their expectations. And after that, it turned out that those expectations turned into very, very quickly turned into disappointment for many of those people. First of all, because the government hadn't changed, and then second of all, because of the pension reform, with the with increasing the retirement age, and that was a huge blow for the system. The ratings for the first time in a long time started falling down, and then it was a series of failures, failed elections of the governors in 2018, then very problematic elections in Moscow City Council in 2019. And now we are at this point when the system actually loses the momentum. This is why, and that's now I'm heading to my main point, the system needs this kind of plebiscite right now at this point. And that might be even more important, at least right now, than the content of this plebiscite. Because nobody is actually sure about what the content would be. That would be a very important political event that will accumulate. It's supposed to accumulate. At least it is supposed to accumulate the support for the president and for the regime. This I think is already a clear attempt at retaking the initiative. And the second thing, so that was the first thing, and second thing, and I will be very, very brief on that, is that even though there are many explanations and interpretations of what is the point of these constitutional reforms, and I guess we will be talking about that for a while tonight. But one thing that is probably clear for the elites, at least for the bureaucracy, is that Vladimir Putin is not going to run for the presidency again. This is the message they've got. Perhaps the only message they got, because the rest is still pretty much obscure, but this is the message they've got, and we are living already for 1 month under this shared understanding. This is not running again. So these are two, I guess, most important things, and they can explain why, for instance, the such strange thing as Constitutional Commission was needed, which is supposed to represent the people without having a Constitutional Assembly. This is something required to change Russian Constitution. So basically, they're changing the Constitution without changing it. And for that reason, we are now having this fake of Constitutional Commission that only gathered once, after which the amendments were released immediately. So basically, they had no opportunity to affect those amendments. So these, I think, are two crucial takeaways so far from what is going on in Russia. Sorry for being long.
No, it's fine. Thank you very much. We can then follow up later, and also then the audience will still, I'm pretty sure, have more questions on that. But I would now say we would go to Irina Bolgova. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, perfectly well.
Very good. Irina is Associate Professor at the Moscow State Institute for International Relations. And I would like now to switch a little bit from the domestic perspective more into the foreign perspective of what this actually means for Russians, maybe foreign policy. And I would say that many commentators have highlighted that Putin will stay in power after 2024. And you just now say at least he will. Nobody knows what he's going to do exactly, but he will not be a candidate for the president anymore. But however, do you think it is likely that there will be main changes in Russia's foreign policy if you look now at the constitutional changes? Or what is Russia aiming for in its foreign policy in the years to come? What is your stance on that?
Thank you very much. It's quite a new pleasure to use this format. I will try to be brief and clear as far as it's possible. About the changes in the government and the potential implications. No.
Can you keep speaking? It was just stopping very shortly.
Okay. So, talking about the changes in the government and the potential implications for the foreign policy. we have to underline that the ministers that are responsible for foreign policy, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Defense Minister, stayed their posts. So that would mean that the president is quite satisfied with what's happening. And the second point is that the president is, according to the constitution, the president is in charge of the foreign policy initiative. So as far as Putin is in power, foreign policy will stay as it is. If we look at the official discourse, at the foreign policy concept, we will see that the idea of the continuity of Russian foreign policy is always present. So what is Russia officially and overtly underlining? That its foreign policy is embedded in Russia's history and is like clear and maybe understood by everybody who wants to follow Russia's history and Russian foreign policy. What's interesting about the current period of Russia's foreign policy is that counterintuitively, there is a paradox between the geopolitical stance of Russia and the material basis for the foreign policy. So, according to the realist perspective, the modest share of the global GDP, the technological drawbacks, the demographic stagnation, aligned with the sanctions of the West, should hamper Russia's foreign policy. But we see the opposite. Because as Russia is highly integrated in the global political system and economic system, it sees that its foreign policy as a necessary investment for the future economic and technological development. Russia overtly strives for the so-called just world order that would allow equally beneficial conditions for economic development for all different types of domestic political systems. And that's why, in fact, Russia supports the new types of formats like BRICS or Shanghai Cooperation Organization. The summits of the both will be held in Russia in 2020. At the same time, Russia holds up to the institutional legacy of the previous world order, with the Security Council as a central institution of global governance. And it's interesting to say that in January, President Putin announced that the Security Council 5 should have a meeting in order to discuss the problems of global uncertainty and the threats to further global development. And this appeal was welcomed, for example, by a French president. But however, in the context of this global polycentricity, with the new centers arising, such initiatives do not seem well-timed because they are, well, more or less discriminating these new centers of world order. Thus, well, globally speaking, Russian foreign policy is currently trapped between these idea of preserving the comfortable institutions of global governance where Russia has high status, and with the discussions of the multipolarity and new growing centers. Then, if we look a little bit with more specifics on regional dimensions, then, as it was already mentioned at the very beginning of the meetings, for example, at the Middle East, Russia is currently considered to be the indispensable mediator and is playing with every party involved within the region. I would say that for Russia, the current Middle East situation is very comfortable, as it is a sort of traditional diplomacy where interests and like pragmatism is more important than stable alliances and values and like traditional frameworks. If we look at the Eurasian situation, then we have to mention that Ukraine is still a very complicated issue, and even with the slight changes in December 2019, no one would say that the real changes are possible. Talking about the Russian perspective, I would say that in Moscow there is no clear consensus what would be considered as a success of Russian position. If there is no clear vision of the optimal outcome of the situation, then the politics will be very situative and unstable. Talking about the Eurasian integration project, I would say that it was and it is still important for Russian foreign policy only in the context of its global cloud. So if it gives more advantages to Russia in this global self-positioning, it is interesting for Russian foreign policy. When it is not, then Russia loses interest to the multilateral framework. And currently we see that, in fact, the Eurasian integration discourse is focused on the bilateral relations between Russia and Belarus. Unless we see any positive result within these bilateral relations, we probably will not see any further moves within the Eurasian integration. And in the relations with Belarus, we see that Russia is very pragmatic. So if Russia is paying for the stability of the Belarusian regime, then it wants the loyalty of the regime. If the result is not seen as optimal, then, well, Russia ends to support the domestic political situation. As far as the relations with the European Union, again, Russian position is not changing. I mean, it's not drastically changing. Russia is always promoting the idea of European collective security that would include the actors that are important for the system of collective security. And the idea of the ideal type of Russian foreign policy would be to have the relations with the European Union that is independent from the United States. Well, it's very straightforward, but it's like that. So the main question that Russia has towards the European Union is to what extent the European Union may be independent. Is this question worthwhile or not? That's another type of reasoning, but I think that as far as the European Union is not open to the cooperation with Russia, Russia becomes more and more inclined to cooperation with China because it sees the cooperation with China as a resource for its global self-positioning. Even despite the fact that in Russia everybody understands the challenges and the threats of the close cooperation with China due to the disbalances, the economic, demographic, and even military insecurity. And my final point would be about the ideological component of Russian foreign policy, because often, like, included in the discussions about Russian self-positioning, and I would underline here again that Russian foreign policy is very pragmatic, and even we may say that it lacks strategy. It has the optimal vision, but it does not necessarily have the list of interlinked goals how to get this ideal vision. In fact, currently and internationally and domestically, the official discourse is very much dominated by the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. And these wars of memories that are very present in the media in Russia and in European countries also, as far as I can see. But I would say that this ideological component in Russia is very much domestically driven and is very much directed to the consolidation of the society, much more than to the international audience and to the idea that we have to make Western audience believe that I don't know, that the history is on our side. So to conclude, I would say that Russian official discourse and Russian foreign policy in its practical realization is very open, overt, and should be clear to our partners. But I don't know, for example, you can see me, I cannot see the audience, and I cannot assess what influences your perception of me. That would be the metaphor of our relations between Russia and the European Union.
Very well put. Thank you very much. You will also then have the possibility, she will stay with us, you can also ask questions later to her. I think it's very interesting. I mean, you mentioned that the foreign minister stayed the same, the defense minister, so we are going to see mostly a continuity and also that it's Russian foreign policy is based on pragmatism and interest as well. Now let's go back to what has been going on within Russia, and I welcome again Alexander Dubowy. He's the scientific coordinator of the Research Center for Eurasian Studies and also the head of research of the Institute for Security Policy. So welcome, Alexander. And we already mentioned, and Greg Udin also said that it was quite surprisingly what happened with the constitutional reforms. But I would like to go back to the where do I have it? To the title of our discussion, to say, what do you think? How could post-Putin Russia look after Putin?
Thank you. Thank you very much it's always a pleasure to organize the events together with the National Institute for Peace. So nice to be here again. I will be talking on the constitutional reform, the possible future role of Putin, but also on the future of the relations between the European Union and Russia. I will not be going into details, so there will be quite a bunch of things to discuss later on. So let's start with the following. So, at least to some extent, we are entering a new phase of Russian politics, which we can call a post-Putin era. So the power system which was created by Vladimir Putin since early 2000s is changing slowly but fundamentally. And the post-Putin Russia is also a reality, at least to some extent, reality just now. But nevertheless, Vladimir Putin keeps all options open till the end. So nobody can tell how Russia will look like after 2024. Probably there will be no fundamental changes on the first glance. But Vladimir Putin will definitely leave and will not stay in his role as president of Russia. But the question is, which role will he choose for him after 2024? And I think that now there's a search for an appropriate position for Vladimir Putin for the time after the next presidential elections, in the spirit of the Deng Xiaoping or Lee Kuan Yew. And even in a post-Putin Russia, Putin will remain for quite a long time. So talking about the constitutional reform, I think since a few weeks Russia has entered a whole new phase of its transformation. And after Vladimir Putin's announcements in his State of Union speech, expectations could hardly be greater. So in view of his promises to strengthen the parliament at the expense of the president, the former Russian Minister of Finance, Alexei Kudrin, is said to have spoken of delicate steps towards a parliamentary republic. But after we have seen these new constitutional amendments, at least a preliminary conclusion can be the following. So, what do we know so far? All changes that are planned are on a large scale, purely cosmetic in nature. Purely cosmetic. Even the extension of the presidential competences merely confirms the already established constitutional practice so far. So, in the presidential draft law, almost no elements of parliamentary republicanism can be found. Only the announced limitation of presidential terms of office is to come so far. And it immediately, it immediately stands out that the president's powers are not limited by this reform, but are substantially expanded. Substantially. So, for example, in Article 83 of the Constitution of the Russian Federation, litera D1 is included, which grants the president the explicit right to appoint, but also to dismiss the heads of federal bodies, including federal ministers in the fields of defense, security, home affairs, justice, foreign affairs, civil protection, and public security. This was not the case so far. And the only prerequisite for these appointments are just a consultation with the Council of the Federation. Just a consultation, no more than that. So the Council of the Federation will have no rights of whatever, just a consultation. Second, there are at least two quite controversial amendments. The first one is the new version of Article 79 of the Constitution of Russian Federation. So, in future, if decisions are taken by international associations, intergovernmental bodies, including those in which Russia participates, for example, European Court of Human Rights, those decisions, I quote, shall not be enforceable in Russia, which are based on an interpretation of an international agreement that is contrary to the Russian constitution. So what does this mean? It's quite difficult to understand. But Russia retains the sovereignty to interpret the implementation of the decisions of the European Court of Human Rights. So, and this new planned version of Article 79 obviously contradicts the higher ranking norm of Article 15 of the Russian Federation. So let's call it an attempt to square the constitutional circle. If you cannot change Articles 15, just change another norm and you will reach your goal. And the second controversial amendment are the plans to strengthen a body called State Council. State Council is an advisory body to the president, which was established by a presidential decree back in the year 2000. It was just an advisory body. It was planned to change the constitution and to add some new articles on this State Council. So it was said that the State Council will become a very important, very central figure in the future political system of Russia. But this is also not going to happen. The State Council will stay just an advisory body, pure advising with the president, and helping the president to exercise his constitutional duties. In this amendment, we will find some references to the future task of this State Council. In particular, to the competence to ensure coordinated functioning and interaction of all the bodies of state power, and to determine the guidelines of the internal and foreign policy of the state. But these are just literal representation of presidential competencies pursuant to Articles 80 and Article 81. So it's just an indication that the functioning, that the goal of this State Council will be just an advisory one. So, so far so unclear, just these funny constitutional matters. But let's take a short look on the future of the EU-Russia relations and discuss the question, what will this constitutional reform mean for the future of our relationship with Russia? So almost nothing at all. As I said, purely cosmetic changes. I think that in the current, in the relationship between the EU and Russia, current dynamics will basically be maintained, not only in the year 2020, but also in the next 2 to 3 years. Despite the sanctions, mutual geo-economic dependencies will remain strong, especially in the energy sector. It's just a fact, like it or not. And it's, in any case, let's call it a strategic decoupling between EU and Russia, which was initiated after the annexation of Crimea and the outbreak of the conflict in the eastern Ukraine back in 2014, will continue also this year, but I think also till the year 2024. And the EU will remain divided in its relationship with Russia, and these sanctions will be definitely maintained. And in this way, EU-Russia relations take on quite a hybrid character, oscillating between cooperation, geo-economic cooperation, and confrontation. And in view of this new modus vivendi, Russia will focus on intensifying bilateral cooperations and relations with EU member states, but not with the whole Union. And as I said before, this year a profound transformation of the political system of the Russian Federation has started, and Russia will remain quite stable in economic, social and financial terms. But this is an interesting point. To ensure a successful internal transformation, Russia needs to stabilize its foreign policy environment. So, to ensure the internal transformation process till 2024, some of the conflicts in the post-Soviet space should be, if not solved, so at least frozen. And from this point of view, it's quite interesting if we take just a short glance on the Russian-Ukrainian policy so far. Just about 2 weeks ago, the advisor to the Russian president, Vladislav Surkov, was told advisor to the president, Vladislav Surkov, was the man who was just the author of the Russian-Ukraine policy since the year 2014. But the advisor to the president on the Ukraine question will change. Actually, he has already been changed. So since today it's official, Dmitry Kozak will become the next advisor on Ukraine issues. Dmitry Kozak is the deputy head of the presidential administration and very important person in this pro-Western financial economic group of Russian elites. Has a very good relationship to the new head of Ukrainian presidential administration, Andriy Yermak. And so there's at least some hope that the conflict in eastern Ukraine will be at least frozen. And that is, this conflict is not going to escalate again. So that's almost it. So what can be done from the Austrian point of view? Almost nothing. Or at least it would be better not to do anything. Just wait and see. Just wait and see. There is just a very little chance to change anything till 2024. I think we should wait till this transformation process has come to an end. And until this time, Austria should position itself as a reliable partner within the European Union. And any active mediation, just no active mediation whatsoever. No active mediation, because it's quite impossible to influence the European Russia agenda till 2024. Just wait and see.
Thank you, Alexander. So when it comes to the constitutional reform, I would say you probably then agree with Ivan Krastev when he was saying the players are being rearranged, but the conductor remains the same?
Look, the conductor remains the same and the players remain the same, so more or less.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Maybe, Greg, you didn't have one more very short question, I would say, so that we then also afterwards have then the possibility to talk to the audience as well. But do you see with what is going on, because I think it's interesting that Alexander was saying that the president actually became stronger due to this constitutional changes which are probably going to happen. And what we read...
I tell you, the role of the president, the constitutional role, was strengthened.
Yes.
But actually, his competences remain the same. Yeah, but his constitutional position was a little bit strengthened, but not more than that.
And what was also strengthened, as I hear, will be strengthened is the role of the parliament as well, in the sense that they are then able also to suggest ministers, which then has the president has then to accept, if I'm not mistaken. Currently, they are selected by the president and approved by the parliament, and now it's going to be the other way around. But the question goes to Greg, because my question is actually, does this give more room, from your point of view, to the opposition within Russia, or like civil society actors, or don't you see that this is going to influence at all?
You mean the constitutional changes?
Yes. No.
Zero influence. I think actually there are perhaps three main things to discuss about those amendments, even though I generally agree that those are basically cosmetic amendments. But still there are three important things that might have strong implications. Actually, two of them were already mentioned by Alexander. One of them is the priority of national law over international law. And now we have two, I would say, that's just my sense, mutually contradictory articles in the Constitution. We are going to have them in April, of course. Mutually contradictory articles of the Constitution. One of them declares the superiority of the international law, and the other one says, well, if we don't like international law, then national law applies. This is number one. Number two is the State Council. I think it is important, and it has, this potentially has a very wide area of competences. Actually coincides with the competence of the president, and even though it is going to be mentioned now in the Constitution, it is not clearly defined, and that is at least an opening for a completely independent body mentioned in the Constitution but not regulated under the Constitution. So basically this is at least possibly a body that represents nobody but has a lot of power under this Constitution, this new project of Constitution. And now the third thing, and that deals directly with the issue of the opposition, is the distinction or the division between the state power and the local power. So those things, according to Article 12 of the Russian Constitution, are held independent. So local power, municipal power, is independent from the state power. Now that created a lot of issues for the state recently, particularly in 2019 during the Moscow Parliament campaign, because in Moscow we have a real new wave of pretty young politicians who are employing, who are using the grassroots techniques, and those are democratic politicians who are popular enough to get elected onto the municipal bodies, and now they are obviously popular enough to get elected into the Moscow City Council. And for that reason, we had this long and very problematic campaign. We can discuss it if there would be any interest in that. But obviously, this is perceived as a threat for the unified system of state power. And for that reason, now they've introduced, once again, they cannot change Article 12 nor Article 15 without changing the whole Constitution. So for that reason, they introduced the concept, once again, undefined, but they introduced the concept of unified system of public power in the Constitution, one of the other articles of the Constitution. And now it says that it is encompassing both the state power and the local power, the municipal power. So once again, we have a contradiction now. This is the second contradiction already. Article 12 says that they are independent, while this new formula of the unified public power encompasses two of them. And that was deliberately meant, of course, to limit the room for local politics, for municipal politics. We don't know so far how it's going to work. It will require probably amendments in a number of laws. But I think this is obviously a reaction to what was happening in Russia in 2019, because these democratic politics, this local politics, is now perceived as a threat to the regime. So now we already have two points of reactions. The first point and the second point, I've mentioned it, the whole idea of holding a plebiscite is obviously a reaction to the fact of losing the initiative and losing the control over the political life of Russian politics in general.
Stephanie, if you're allowed,
Yes, please, very shortly.
Two brief remarks. You're absolutely right. The State Council is only mentioned once in the Constitution. But because of that, it cannot become an influential body formally, but only in an informal way, similar to that of the presidential administration. Presidential administration is, till today, the probably most influential informal political body in Russia, a kind of a shadow cabinet of the president. But because of that, State Council will remain dependent on the President. If President wishes, allows, and helps the State Council to become a powerful informal institution, it will become a powerful informal institution. If not, then not. And in the latter case, there will be definitely conflicts between the State Council and the presidential administration. And I don't think that Russian elites too want a conflict of two informal but very influential bodies. That's the first point, the first problem with this new State Council. The second problem is what will be the future role of Putin? Will he become kind of secretary to the State Council? All the members of the State Council, also its secretary, will be appointed by the President. So this is so far said in the Constitution. But if the President appoints the secretary of the State Council, then he can also dismiss this secretary. So if Putin becomes a secretary to the State Council, he can be dismissed by a new president at any time. That's the first problem. The second problem is, of course, also after 2024, Putin will definitely remain the most influential person within the whole Russian political system. Definitely. Just sees it this way. He is the man who built Russia. Since 20 years, he's building this house of Russia. And I don't think that he will abandon his house after 2024. So he will have to find a solution for this problem. I don't think that he will become a new prime minister. So there will not be a similar thing that we saw between 2008 and 2012. So this just change between Medvedev and Putin. This will not happen. Maybe as ultima ratio. If everything goes wrong, then again Medvedev will become the new president and Putin will become the prime minister. When everything goes wrong. But if not, Putin will remain the most influential person in this system. And if they get the position of the secretary of the State Council, then sooner or later, I think sooner than later, there will be two centers of power in Russia, very influential ones. The first one, the new president, who is the most powerful figure within the constitutional system, and Vladimir Putin, who is the most influential figure within the political system. And in this case, there will be definitely a conflict between these two centers of gravity, centers of power. And actually, Vladimir Putin doesn't want this to happen. I don't think so, actually. So just first very short remark on the State Council. So it's this problem between the legal side of the matter and the political side of it. I think with the extension of the presidential powers, the expansion of presidential influence over the Council of the Federation, in future 10% of the members of the Council of Federation will be the so-called presidential...
Appointed by the
president. Thank you. And there's also another thing that was introduced during this constitutional reform, an additional veto right over parliamentary legislative initiatives. So the president has a constitutional right to withstand any legislative initiatives by the parliament. But after 22nd of April, there will be an additional veto right. Second one. So, what is the Russian, what is Kremlin planning, if you want so? I think this constitution reform is a reaction to the protests of 2018-2019. Kremlin wants to maintain the control during this phase of transitive power and is preparing for a probably non-cooperative State Duma after the next parliamentary elections or the elections after the next elections. But this just very last remark. Maybe this is only the first step on the way to an entire reform of the whole state system.
Thank you, Alexander. One very last question from my side to Irina now, but you're also free to react to what the colleagues have been said if you would like to, so just to let you know. I would have one last question now. If we look from the perspective of the European Union, and we know that recently, I would say relations with the European Union and Russia, I mean, when we hear about the Salisbury attack, I mean, we have the sanctions, the situation in Ukraine, the incidents in the street of Kerch. So I would say the relation is not really that stable. And then, of course, we also have like security implications now with the abandoning of the INF Treaty. We also that is also poses a security threat to Europe, I would say. But what do you think? What could be the strategy now of the European Union to look if they are able to decrease the tensions with Russia?
If I can advise to the European Union.
Yes.
Well, it's a very complicated question. I would retake Russian perspective and be very pragmatic. I think that Russia is quite tired of what's happening in the European Union. I mean, with Brexit and domestic crisis and the search for the new identity within the changing world, including the relations with Russia, the inconsistency of the position towards Russia, because of course, we all know the controversies within the European Union, despite the fact that there is a consensus about the sanctions. So, as I've said, Russian foreign policy is rather tired of the European Union. It does not believe in what the European Union members are sometimes saying. I mean, in trying to be more favorable to Russia than the rest of the European Union. And I think that Russia is more keen on the idea of the turn to the East, the global turn, not Russian foreign policy turn, but the shift to the East. And as I've said, as Russia is looking for the resources to increase its global stance, the more time is going on, the less these resources are seen in the European Union and in the cooperation with the European Union. Maybe Russian foreign policy is wrong. But as far as I can see it, Russian foreign policy will not specifically search for the favorable attitude from the side of the European Union. If Brussels does not want Russia, then Russia is going away. It's painful for Russian identity because we are always in the situation to feel ourselves European and to be rejected as a European state. But it is a result of the latest years of our relationship with Europe.
Thank you very much, Irina. I would now suggest to go into the audience and please raise your hand if you have a question. And yes. No question? Yeah. Okay, there's one first.
If nobody else, then of course, the first thing is on the Constitution. Nobody says that there will not be another change of the Constitution and the strengthening of the State Council. Or Putin is powerful enough to be the secretary or chairman of the State Council and have power beyond the legal possibility of the new president to attack him. It was like when Medvedev was president. So I think it's not the end of the game. And when I agree very much with what Greg Udin said about the plebiscite, then you have this direct relationship with the citizens. If that can be continued, then Putin will be strong even after 24, whatever position he will have. Of course, he must have some formal position, but some changes are possible. So I think it's not worthwhile to think too much about the present new structure if we don't know if it's the one. Putin couldn't have a real change in the constitution because then he would diminish his power already now. He will not do that. If he would do it, would be afterwards. But may I ask to Irina, the situation in the Middle East is, as you said, Russia for the moment is able to speak to everybody, but that means also it has some, she has also some relationship, some responsibility. Responsibility, for example, towards Israel, in keeping away Iran forces too much. So my question would be, first of all, what was internally the feeling when General Soleimani was killed? Was Russia in some way happy because that means a reduction of influence of Iran, of some troops of Hezbollah and so on in Syria, because that makes it easier for Russia to have a balance between Syria on the one hand and Israel on the other hand. So what was the feeling there? Secondly, now about the situation with Turkey. Is that a small dispute now about Idlib, or may it be a longer term? Maybe you can a bit develop that kind of situation which may arise in the coming years in the Middle East if the position of Russia, to be able to speak to everybody can be kept, or new conflicts may arise. Thank you.
Maybe you can answer directly as long as there is no other question for now. Irina?
Yeah, sure.
Then we have...
So unfortunately, I'm not a specialist on the Middle East affairs, so I may talk rather generally. But the issues that you were mentioning, the responsibility before our traditional partners and the way how the alliances are structured in the Middle East. Well, I think that Russian foreign policy accepts it as as a current situation. I mean, talking about Turkey, after our airplane was shut down by Turkey several years ago, everybody understands that Turkey is not an ally in this European understanding of the term. It is the necessary partner for each situation when we need some balance. Your question about Idlib is really very acute because, as far as I can see it now, Russian foreign policy is not very happy with what is happening. The assumption was to have a little bit more strong and stable cooperation with Turkey on Middle East affairs, and now we are really very fragile, I would say. But still, as the politics is really very pragmatic, then it will be continued like that. Having balances between everybody, maybe some sort of shadow diplomacy, in particular if we are talking about Israel.
Thank you. We have another question over there. Maybe you can indicate to whom your question is addressed and who you are.
My question generally, I don't know who will be answering the question, but my question is that could Putinism be considered as a new system of governance, not only for Russia, even for some other country like Middle Eastern countries where I admire Putin? Would the system, even in Russia, could it survive biologically? President Putin too, what's a mixture of totalitarian and democratic regime for the third world, for example. Thank you.
Thank you. There was another question there, and another one then after, behind her, the other lady.
Hello, my question would be to Greg Yudin and Irina Bolgova. I would like to ask about Ukraine and how much it is still present in the Russian discourse in general. Like, what do people talk about it at all? Is there any specific issues that they look at? And the second question would be also about President Zelensky. If how is he perceived by the public and also by the elites? Thank you.
Yes, hello, Narvanaga. So I had a related question about the public opinion to Greg. What are the public opinion towards the Ukraine conflict? And I would add also towards the Russian activities in Syria and in the Middle East. Then for Irina, it's interestingly that you say that, well, basically Russia the last 5 years is trying to go away from Europe towards the China, but honestly, I have no evidence, or you can provide some facts that this going to China has given any benefits, economical benefits for Russia. I know that there are lots of attempts. Yes, and to Alexander, I have the question about, as you are such a good expert on Russia, about social economical situation in Russia, because if we speak about public opinion, social economical factors are the driving force behind every voting and incentives in the public. So, and Putin in last years is trying very much to come up with some strategy for the social economical situation improving. Do you see any developments in this regard? Because also that will be on agenda in 2024. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who would like to start? Maybe Greg. Greg, yes. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. First, the system question. Actually, a very good one, because we have a lot of discussion of how imperfect Russian system is, called by political scientists a hybrid regime, an imperfect regime. Well, my view is the opposite, actually. This is a very good combination of different principles, very stable and robust. And I think it is proved to be so stable just because it exploits the vulnerabilities of liberal democracy. Well, it on the one hand it relies on a democratic procedure, which is elections and regular voting, and it uses it skillfully to create the popular legitimacy, which is very important for liberal democratic regimes. Well, of course, this is where democracy ends, and all other democratic institutions are, of course, suppressed. But the same can be said, at least to a certain extent, of many other liberal democracies. And the general electoralization of politics is one of the major concerns for political theorists nowadays. So for that reason, I think Russia was able to develop a very viable and very up-to-date system just by putting an emphasis on the elections. And for that reason, everyone has this perception that the regime or the president himself are backed by strong popular support. So I think there is a lot of I mean, it almost invites to be adopted in other countries, in other liberal democracies. So from that point of view, I think that this is a very interesting type of regime that might become adopted in many other places. And we see those plebiscitarian tendencies in other countries as well. I mean, look at what is happening in the United States, where the president is behaving increasingly in the same manner. I'm not saying that he's going to violate the constitutional limitations on the number of terms. I don't feel he's heading this way. But the thing that the system invites this kind of leader. Oh, the same thing can be seen once again in France, where after the election of current president, many people were comparing him to de Gaulle. And de Gaulle is, of course, a very good example of Caesarist leader. So I think this tendency towards Caesarism is a very important tendency within liberal democracies. You can just see how it has evolved in Russia. So from that point of view, Russia is not an imperfect regime, but perhaps the next step for many liberal democracies, or at least a reflection of one of the important tendencies. But having said that, I would add that there's still a very interesting reality check for this system. We already mentioned that we have a certain ambiguity in this system. First, Vladimir Putin is not running for presidency again. But second, or on the other hand, we witness certain strengthening of presidential power according to this new constitution, or at least amended constitution. And nobody knows how it's going to play out. Because from the perspective of this type of regime, it looks like a real contradiction. You cannot strengthen your successor. It's just impossible. Not because you shouldn't do that, but just because it's impossible. As long as you're alive, the power is concentrated where you are and not where the president is. This is the attribute of a charismatic power. Probably at this point, Vladimir Putin is thinking of transforming this from an autocratic or personalist regime into a certain sort of corporate state. But I'm not sure it is going to work out just because of the nature of the system. And now the Ukraine question, or as I perceive it, the question of the public opinion towards foreign policy. Well, it is just my view that politics is pretty much about emotions rather than about rational calculation. And I think that what happened back in 2014 was that the government or the president himself were able to seize on a very important emotion of what I call the insulted sovereignty. The perception of being not respected properly. And that was the emotion behind those measures in foreign policy, including the annexation of Crimea, including the outbreak of the war in eastern Ukraine, including the military action in Syria. So that was the dominant emotion, and was pretty much there. But all kinds of emotion, I mean, they're temporary. They tend to evaporate sooner or later. And the scholars who are doing public opinion research, they started observing this turn towards domestic policy already back in 2018. So people are a bit tired of the foreign policy. They're rather curious about what is going to happen in Russia, in this country, and what is the agenda. And that's something which is not clear to anyone. Once again, the amendments on the Constitution were announced by the president himself, and only a very, very limited number of people were aware of them, like probably 4 or 5 people in the whole country were aware of those changes. Which means that there is demand for a clear agenda to be set. And there is also a strong doubt that this particular elite, aged as it is, pretty much trapped in the past, in the Soviet history as it is, that this elite is able to do that. So there is both a demand for consistent domestic policy, but at the same time a serious doubt that these elites is well situated to do that.
Thank you, Alexander. The social economic
Irina,
situation.
Maybe it would be
just
as you wish. Okay, fine.
The social economic situation, Alexander.
Thank you. Look, there was a social populist rhetoric in the State of Union address. Definitely. But let's just take a bit deeper look on this one. So, Russian foreign policy is often interpreted as a continuation of the domestic policy. So it's often said that military interventions are means of raising the political rankings. But in reality, it's just an opposite of that. Vladimir Putin's domestic policy is a continuation of his foreign policy. So to understand his economic policy, we should understand the main purpose of his foreign policy. And the goal of his foreign policy can be called a counter-revolutionary and restorative one. So the primary way to restore the lost positions is to carefully avoid the mistakes that led the Soviet Union to a geopolitical loss. And one of these reasons, actually the main reason, was an economical collapse of the country. And because of that, Vladimir Putin is, let's call it as spontaneous or rather an intuitive proponent of market economy. He considers capitalism as the foundation of Russia's security and competitiveness. And in the end of the day, as the foundation of successful foreign policy. On the one hand, he's quite skeptical about the big owners, about the oligarchs who emerged in the 90s. However, he's not a social populist. He had not done what was expected by almost the majority of the Russian citizens. He had not annulled the results of privatization and had not returned to the state-led economy, just it was the case in Belarus or in some other countries of the post-Soviet area. So, and he's not pushing a social state within Russia. So a bloated social state is too expensive and undermines Russia's global competitiveness from his point of view. And because of that, such measures as fixed prices for basic goods, early retirement, increases in wages and pensions at the expense of the state are not going to happen, although these changes, these reforms are decided by the population. So financial security is considered more important than political ratings. But Putin is ready for social spending when it's not just to support the consumption or his popularity. So whenever the support is directly related to the topic of security, he will do that. So, for example, the maternity capital. So that's actually it. Don't know if you like it or not.
Thank you, Alexander. And the last word goes to you, Irina. The question is still, maybe on Ukraine, it was, the question on Ukraine is still open, and then on Russia and China.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would completely agree with Greg on what he said about the Ukrainian issue in the perception of Russian public opinion and, in fact, in the media and in the discourse. As it was very sharp emotionally in the first years of the conflict in Ukraine and over Ukraine, it was really very fatiguing and not possible to continue the same level of emotion. And that's why, as far as currently the conflict is more or less frozen, so there is no triggering events that would renew the emotion, then the perception is rather calm, if I may use this word, to this very situation. I mean, I can hear Ukrainian language in Moscow, so there are some people who are, for several reasons, are coming to Russia. I know that Russians are going to Ukraine, even if the number of visits diminished crucially. But I would not say that this issue is really important for the domestic social or political relations, and it's not really present in the official or non-official discourse. As far as Russia-China issue is concerned, when I was talking about Russia's inclination towards China as a reaction to the crisis in the relations between Russia and the European Union, I was trying to underline this symbolic effects of Russian foreign policy when the main goal is not to create something in common with the European Union as it was used to be in the pre-2014 period, but to try to find some benefits from the cooperation with China that is now perceived as a sort of natural partner. But of course, the substance of this cooperation with China, if compared to our wish to cooperate with the European Union, is different. And if we are talking about the economic basis for the cooperation with China, of course, everybody understands the asymmetry in demography, in economic power, in the structure of mutual trade, and of course Russia understands the challenges of becoming not a junior partner, but a sort of dependent partner of China. Even if we take one example of the Power of Siberia pipeline that started to operate from Russia to China, the gas pipeline, we may say that on the one hand, it is a means of diminish Russia's dependency of energy cooperation with the European Union. On the other hand, it's just one next apple in the basket of our dependency on economic cooperation with China. But the current global structure, regional structure is like that. And so as policy is the art of possible, then Russian foreign policy is doing what's possible currently.
Thank you very much, Irina. And
just a short follow-up.
Yes, please, Greg, very much.
Just because I think it's important. Well, it's actually about Zelensky. I have no quantitative evidence, no statistics about that, but I have some qualitative evidence from the research we did last year. And it seems to me that the figure of Zelensky has actually resonated with the younger portions of Russian population. It's because it's a completely different type of leader. He's younger, he's a comedian, he's democratic, he's public, he's open. And that has landed very well with some portions of Russian population, particularly younger, particularly youngsters. And there is a general cleavage, which could be seen last year in 2019 during those Moscow protests. When asked about the attitude towards those protests, both Muscovites and Russians in general, first of all, they were, well, that was split. Roughly like 30% positive, 30% negative, and like 40% neutral. But that was strongly correlated with the age. Strongly correlated. So the level of at least sympathy towards protests was much higher among the youngsters, just probably because they would like to see a different type of politics, different style, different political style. And then was strongly correlated to the media consumption. Those who are still dependent on state TV, they are mostly elderly people, and they tend to support the government and to resent the protesters no matter what they are demanding. Whereas those who are less dependent on state TV, or at least who have multiple channels of information, consume information from multiple channels, they tend to be younger, and they tend to be more sympathetic to these kinds of movements, and that, I think, has something to do with the figure of Zelensky as well.
Thank you very much. I think we are now at the ending of our event. Maybe just very, very shortly to conclude, I can say that we can all agree that at least Putin was surprising us and the world again. However, changes are not going to be happening in a substantial way. There is not really more room for political competition, and the legitimation of the regime lies upon these also frequent plebiscites, as you have been arguing. When it comes to foreign policy, we see the ministers are still the same, so foreign policy will be continuing in the sense that it has been in the last year. It's based especially on pragmatism and interest, and Russia would probably prefer the European Union to be a bit less independent on the US in order to keep up better relations. Otherwise, it could be in the future that it turns a little bit more towards the east. Thank you very much, especially for our guests, especially for Greg Yudin, who came from Moscow, especially for Irina, who took her time to be sitting there for 2 hours talking to us, and of course also to Alexander, who has been also part of the organizing team. A special thanks to all of you for coming and for being interested in these topics, and I wish you a nice evening. We still prepared a glass of water or wine outside. You can still ask the question you wanted to raise right now, so please feel free, chat a little bit with each other, and otherwise get home safely, and yes, maybe a big hand for our speakers, and enjoy the evening. Thank you very much.
Idealism prevails. Make the world a better place.